Hello, and welcome back to Tea with RHJC. I am Kristen McMahon, and I have the pleasure of serving as the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. This past week's research, and now today's chat, was born out of some questions I received last week. So this week we're going to talk about why Nuremberg was chosen as the site for the first trial, and why Justice Jackson was chosen to be the chief counsel for the United States and ultimately the chief U.S. prosecutor for the first trial. This year marks the 75th anniversary of the Nuremberg trials, and I'm thrilled that you're joining us today to travel down the road to Nuremberg. Let's start with Nuremberg then. So Article 22 of the London Charter reads as follows. The permanent seat of the tribunal shall be in Berlin. The first meetings of the members of the tribunal and of the chief prosecutors shall be held at Berlin in a place to be designated by the Control Council of Germany. The first trial shall be held at Nuremberg, and any subsequent trials shall be held at such places as the tribunal may decide. For clarity, the Control Council was the joint governance structure set up after Germany surrendered, whereby France, Great Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States acted as the supreme authority in all matters affecting Germany as a whole. So clearly, by August 8th, when the London Agreement and Charter were signed, there had been significant discussions regarding location. Let's first consider the physical space necessary for the tribunal to occur. First, you'd need a courtroom of a certain size, but the number of people who would need to be accommodated in that courtroom was unknown at this point. There would be some number of defendants, some number of lawyers and staff on each trial team for the prosecution, some number of lawyers and staff defending the accused, some number of journalists, some number of interested visitors, and the 8 judges, the 4 primary and the 4 alternate. And the vast majority of all of these people would need to be in the courtroom every day. Separate from the courtroom, you'd need offices for people to work. This included space to organize, duplicate, and house the thousands of pages of documentary evidence. And keep in mind, every document needed to be in 4 languages: Russian, French, German, and English. So everybody involved could understand them. This also meant communications facilities, both for internal communications and communications with the external world by lawyers, staff, and journalists. This trial also required space for newer technology, such as capability for simultaneous translation of every word spoken into one of the 4 languages. And then you'd also need a separate space for the judges and the witnesses. Now, in addition just to the courtroom and office space, you'd need a place nearby to hold the sum number of alleged Nazi war criminals. And that was a number that had not yet been worked out and would not be worked out until after the London Agreement was signed. You'd need space to feed all of these people and also take care of other bodily needs. And finally, you'd need some place for all those who were not a defendant to live and sleep. Now, the Soviets believed that the tribunal should be held in Berlin, and preferably in the zone that it occupied. The United States was fine with the trial being in Berlin, but preferred it to be in their occupation zone. The U.S. Army, however, advised Justice Jackson that Berlin was not an ideal place for this to happen. It was already overcrowded, a large portion of it had been damaged or destroyed, and its resources were already overstretched. Justice Jackson then needed to go on some location scouts. So he visited Munich first, but didn't find a suitable site there. And then General Lucius Clay, who was the military governor of the portion of Germany under the command of the United States, suggested Justice Jackson look at Nuremberg. Now, Nuremberg had a lot to recommend it, but we'll start with a look at its historical significance. The Second Nationwide Nazi Party convention was held in Nuremberg in September of 1923. The first had been held in Munich in January of that year. And in addition to that one in September, multi-day enormous rallies were also held in Nuremberg in 1927, 1929, and then annually from 1933 through 1938 on grounds that were specifically built for those rallies' purposes. Now, these rallies were carefully staged propaganda events that included lengthy speeches delivered by Adolf Hitler and other Nazi Party leaders, goose step marches, torchlight processions and bonfires, Wagnerian orchestrations, and other music designed to stir the martial heart. The buildings were draped in Nazi flags and festooned with insignia. And hundreds of thousands of party members and spectators attended these rallies. They were designed to showcase Nazi fervor and strength, both in Germany and around the world. And often these rallies were used to announce Nazi policies, such as the two laws passed in September 1935. These two laws, which came to be known as the Nuremberg Laws, provided the legal framework for the systematic persecution of Jewish people in Germany, and eventually the territories it conquered or annexed. The first was the Reich Citizenship Law, which declared that only people of German or kindred blood could be citizens of Germany. Through this, and a number of other decrees, a Jewish person was legally defined as someone who had 3 or more grandparents born into the Jewish religious community, and a Jewish person was not a citizen of Germany, but a subject of the state. The second law was the Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor, and this law prohibited marriage between a Jewish person and a non-Jewish German. It also criminalized sexual relations between them. So Nuremberg played a significant role in the history and the propaganda machine of the Nazi regime. Now, during the course of the war, Allied bombing had destroyed or severely damaged about 90% of the town. However, there were some very important places for our purposes that escaped this destruction. The first being the Palace of Justice, and then directly linked to it, the jail. And so now we're back to where we started in this story with the location scouting. As General Clay noted, the town of Nuremberg was not currently being used for other governmental or military purposes. So the living spaces, although in need of repair, were far less crowded than they were in Berlin. Jackson reported back to the London conference that the courtroom of the Palace of Justice was, quote, likely not as large as it ought to be, but it was larger than any other courtroom standing. And the jail facilities were very adequate. In fact, the jail could hold up to about 1,200 prisoners. Plus, there was enough office space for everyone. So on July 21st, Jackson and representatives from Great Britain and France flew to Nuremberg. Russia had also been invited, but they declined at the last moment. Those in attendance agreed with Justice Jackson's assessment, including that work needed to be done to get the courtroom ready. And after returning to London, they collectively worked to break down the Russian resistance. Finally, on August 2nd, it was agreed that the trial would occur in Nuremberg, and work modifying Courtroom 600 in the Palace of Justice began in earnest. If you're interested in learning more about Courtroom 600, let me direct you to the Memoriam Nuremberg Trials website, where you can read about the fairly significant construction that was done to the Palace of Justice, the jail, and the courtroom itself, and learn about its subsequent use. Recently, Courtroom 600 stopped functioning as an active courtroom, so it can serve as an exhibit and education space. And we'll put the URL in the comments, and you can also find them on Twitter at Courtroom 600. We also have a couple of photos to show you as well, and we'll put those in the comments section since I can't share my screen while I'm doing a live stream. The first is a picture of the jail. In case you're wondering, the guards peering into the cells are on suicide watch. Although precautions had been taken to prevent suicides, about a month before the trial began, one of the prisoners, Robert Ley, who had overseen German labor during the war, succeeded in strangling himself with a noose he had from rope he had fashioned from some towels. And after that, guards were stationed to watch the prisoners in the cells around the clock. The second photo is taken in the courtroom, from slightly behind the witness stand, I believe. You can get a sense of how packed the courtroom was and the number of people that needed to fit into it. And if you look closely at the far right side, you'll see Hermann Goering just in front of the 2 soldiers with his fist propping up his chin. So now let's turn to Justice Jackson. By April of 1945, Justice Jackson had been an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court for nearly 4 years. Unlike our process today, Justice Jackson was nominated and confirmed by the Senate on the exact same day, July 11th, 1941. He had been a nationally prominent figure almost from the moment he had assumed his first role in the federal government when he prosecuted Andrew Mellon for income tax evasion. The executive order signed by President Truman on May 2nd, 1945, has only 3 paragraphs. 1, and I'm paraphrasing here, Justice Jackson is designated as the representative of the United States and its chief of counsel in preparing and prosecuting charges of atrocities and war crimes. It also specifically spelled out that he was to receive no additional compensation for this. 2, he was authorized to select those who would assist him in preparing for and proceeding with the trials, and that he was to receive assistance from basically anyone or anything that he asked. And number 3, he was authorized to work with any foreign government necessary. Now, Justice Jackson's appointment by President Truman signaled the seriousness with which the United States viewed the prosecutions of the Nazi war criminals. His appointment encouraged the British, French, and Soviets to appoint a similar caliber of attorney with analogous capability and authority as their representatives. So his counterparts were the Lord Chancellor of Great Britain, who serves as the head of the British judiciary and is a leading member of the cabinet, a judge of the French Cour de Cassation, the highest court of law in France, and the vice president of the Supreme Court of the Soviet Union, which was the highest court of law in the Soviet Union. But the decision to appoint Justice Jackson was grounded more than just in the optics of prestige. Justice Jackson's experiences provided him with a wide range of lenses through which to view the landscape and tackle the challenges. Over the course of his career, he had been a prosecutor and a defense attorney. He had been a senior government official, the occasional international diplomat, and he had a deep level of policy experience from serving in President Roosevelt's cabinet. In fact, he'd been thinking on the legal issues of what the world looks like after the war for quite some time. And one of the crimes that we discussed last week during the talk on the London Agreement and Charter was the crime of aggressive war. That concept and idea had been percolating in his mind from well before the United States entered the war. It underpinned the legal advice he provided as Attorney General to President Roosevelt to provide assistance to Great Britain in 1940 and for the Lend-Lease legislation, among other things. In 1941, he had written a paper for a meeting of the International Inter-American Bar Association in Havana, Cuba. And in that paper, he flatly states, "It does not appear necessary to treat all wars as legal and just simply because we have no court to try the accused." And later in 1941, speaking before the American Bar Association, he advocated for international action to prevent war, recognizing that the prosecutorial mechanism didn't yet exist, but he believed that an imperfect system was better than no system at all. Justice Jackson also had an immutable belief that success of the judicial process lay in a true, real trial. In fact, he gave a speech before the American Society of International Law on April 12, 1945, so mere weeks before he was appointed, part of which warned against farcical trials because they would destroy confidence in the judicial process. He said, "There is no reason for a judicial trial except to reach a judgment on a foundation more certain than suspicions or current rumor. To be considered a true trial, there must be an honest search for the facts, the best sources of proof attainable should be brought forward, and the testimony must be critically examined. In addition, the triers must be willing to hear everything relevant that someone has to say in his defense, and to make it possible for the defendant to obtain evidence as well." I quote, "The ultimate principle is that you must put no man on trial under the forms of judicial proceedings if you are not willing to see him freed, if not proven guilty. If you are determined to execute a man in any case, there is no occasion for a trial." 2 weeks later, President Truman officially requested his service through Judge Samuel Rosenman, who served as Truman's counsel. Judge Rosenman conveyed President President Truman's admiration for Jackson's experience and abilities. They also discussed whether this service would be in conflict with his work on the court. And they both concluded that it would not require his resignation, which Jackson would have given, and that his colleagues likely would allow him the time away to complete this task. Justice Jackson still took a couple of days to think about it. This was a weighty decision, and eventually officially accepted the position, as you all know. And after his appointment was announced on May 2nd, he said, "I would not have taken this burden upon myself if I were not convinced that materials available and procedures possible afford an opportunity to do something toward bringing a just judgment those who have heretofore thought it safe to wage aggressive and ruthless war, and to do it in a way that will be consistent with our traditional insistence upon a fair trial for the accused." So in Justice Jackson, we have a man whose values and beliefs, strength of character and will, and sharp mind and eloquence made him the right man, possibly the only man, at the right time for this role. All right, we're going to open it up to questions now, and I will answer what I can, keeping in mind that I am still learning. And if I don't have a ready answer, I will circle back with you next week. And speaking of that, while you all are formulating your questions, and since we were still figuring out how to really take questions last week, let me address a couple of those that I received. First, someone asked that I explain what kind of tea I'm drinking. Didn't think to do that last week. And since that will likely be the easiest question I get each week, I'm going to start with that softball. So last week, it was a white tea from Mariage Frere called Marco Polo, which seemed fitting to me because we were starting on a new adventure. This week, it is a Genmaicha called Tea of Inquiry from Allegheny Coffee and Tea Exchange in the Strip District of Pittsburgh. Also seemed fitting to me since I am learning. Last week, Ryan asked, were these articles crafted with an eye toward how they may be perceived by future generations? Ryan actually asked two questions, but I'm still researching the other one, so I will answer the one that I can. And so I believe the answer to that, at least with regard to Justice Jackson, is absolutely yes. He clearly understood the precedents that the London Agreement and Charter and the tribunal itself were establishing, and he hoped it would create a renewed fervor for strong international law. He was interested in setting up a mechanism that would more or less make war illegal. In fact, he gave a speech at the University of Buffalo within a week of returning from hearing the verdicts delivered at Nuremberg. So that would have been late September, early October of 1946. And what he said was, when we seek to identify the sources of catastrophe in modern life, in order that we may inquire whether they will yield to control by law, we find the chief source is war and another is tyranny. And then in his opening statement before the tribunal, he makes clear that although that particular trial was applying the law against German aggressors, it wasn't limited to that. He said, the law includes, if it is to serve a useful purpose, it must condemn aggression by any other nations, including those which sit now here in judgment. And then to go back to that speech in Buffalo, towards the end of it, he says, there is a great need that the statesmen pick up where the lawyers left off at Nuremberg. Peace cannot be secured and persecutions cannot be ended cannot be ended except by better formulation of the principles of non-aggression and the adoption of at least a minimum of civil rights for peoples everywhere. And then he ends with, I shall not be surprised if a distant day will recognize this legal condemnation of oppressions and aggressions as civilization's chief salvage from the Second World War. And then last week, Jane also asked, it seems as though I recall significant problems or actions carried out by the Russians. Was Russia ever seriously considered for prosecution? Jane, you might be thinking of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which was an agreement of non-aggression between Russia and Germany that was signed in August of 1939. And so while Germany was moving eastward, the Soviet Union took that opportunity to move westward, and they annexed Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and part of Poland by the end of 1940. They'd also invaded Finland at the end of 1939. But then in June of 1941, Hitler broke the pact and invaded Russia, making it almost all of the way to Moscow by the end of 1941. And he also surrounded and basically starved the residents in Leningrad for about 6 months. So shortly after the invasion, the Soviets turned to the Allied powers for help. The London Agreement and Charter very clearly designates that those who were to be prosecuted were members of the European Axis power. And so by the end of the war in 1945, that basically only included Germany and Italy. Similarly, Japan is not brought in under the London Agreement and Charter either, since it is not a European country. But there were tribunals in Japan and in the surrounding areas, the largest of which was the International Military Tribunals for the Far East, that heard 28 cases against Japanese military and government officials. And that started in April of 1946, but there were other tribunals outside of Japan as well. So let us know what other questions you have, or also what other topics you'd like to see us discuss in these teas. And if you are enjoying these, please sign up to be notified when we go live and share the tea invitations with your friends. And so let's turn to what questions we have today. Let's see. Okay. Tina Harvey, how old was Jackson when he conducted the trials? Okay, give me a quick second. I got to do the math. 41, 46. He was about 46, 47 years old. And there were 3 people who were found innocent at the trials. So 24 indictments were read. 22 actually stood trial, one of whom was tried in absentia. And so out of those, 3 were found innocent, and the remaining 19 were either sentenced to some term of imprisonment or to be executed. William asks, how others selected who assisted with the prosecution? So Justice Jackson actually took applications. There were some attorneys who had been recommended to him, and so he went through a brief interview process for those. And there's certainly we have some stories about people who had applied or were recommended, and Justice Jackson did not see them as good fits. But he really took people he thought could make a good case, who were diligent. You have to remember the rapidity with which the gathering of the evidence and the formulation of the cases, and then ultimately the trial itself came together. From the London Agreement being signed in August 8th of 45, the trial kicked off on November 20th. So that basically within 3 months, they had started the trial. Are there any other questions? Okay, seeing none for now, and feel free to ask other ones later. Let me give you a preview of next week's tea. So next week, we will be leaving the historic, and we're going to discuss a contemporary topic: power and fear, strong men and the virus. And I will be joined by David Crane, who is the only other person to be named a chief U.S. prosecutor, and who was the founding chief prosecutor of the International War Crime Tribunal in Sierra Leone. And we will be discussing how crises present opportunities to seize or consolidate power and limit rights for political gain. So tune in next week. We look forward to seeing you. And thank you for joining us for tea today. For as long as we are all practicing physical distance, we recognize the importance of social connectedness, and we will strive to give you perspective, entertain you, help you learn, and keep you and your loved ones mentally strong. As long as we dream about a world in which the universal principles of equality, fairness, and justice exist, and I know that we all do, we will do our best to keep shining a light on these stories. We look forward to having tea again with you soon. Cheers.